Good morning. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm a representative of KCR, a little bit about my background and our company, and most importantly, why we're here this morning. KCR is a clinical research company. We do trials throughout 4 regions here in North America, Western, Central, and Eastern Europe. We're happy to say that we're celebrating our 20th anniversary, but we're really new to the Cambridge, Boston biotech and clinical research ecosystem, having moved here, putting our U.S. operational hub here in Boston just back in June. So with that, a bit about my background. I've been in business well over 20 years. I've been with some large pharmaceutical companies at Bristol Myers Squibb. I recently came out of the Harvard Clinical Research Institute, and my role as Director of Trial Execution Solutions is really I facilitate the interaction between industry, academia, patient advocacy groups, et cetera, in order to create an environment for good clinical research. I'll tell you a little bit more about our initiative in just a few minutes, but I'd like to now turn over introductions to my colleagues here on the panel.
When we got involved, because my middle son, Benjamin, was diagnosed with a rare disorder called Sanfilippo Syndrome. And after my wife and I got the diagnosis, we met with a specialist, and we were told, go home, love your child, there's nothing you can do. And of course we were going to go home and love our child. That's a given. But the nothing you can do part was something that we just couldn't accept. And over time, we ended up creating our foundation and funding research. First, very basic research, understanding the metabolic pathways of the disease, and then building animal models and potential treatment pathways. And what we learned along the way was we really needed to engage with the researchers beyond just what our scientific advisory board told us was good, solid research to fund. And we also realized we needed to engage with industry and make that research attractive, or in another way of looking at it, de-risk our disease to be brought on and attractive to industry. So we co-developed a patient registry, we co-funded a natural history study, and eventually one of our projects was licensed by industry, and we were even involved in helping get a startup off the ground to bring that to clinical trial. So there's now a gene therapy clinical trial underway for one indication, phase 1/2, and a second in the pipeline.
So, my name is Jim Palma. I'm the Executive Director of Target Cancer Foundation, and we're a rare cancer research and patient support foundation located in Kendall Square. We were founded by my brother-in-law, Paul, who was diagnosed when he was 38 with cholangiocarcinoma, which is a rare cancer of the liver, a rare cancer with a really poor prognosis. Paul had no predisposing factors, no family history, nothing that would point to him getting this diagnosis. But what he very quickly learned is that despite his relative young age and good health, and despite being at one of the top cancer centers in the world, there was nothing that could be done for him. And what he was told was that there was no research into the disease. So Paul started the foundation in response to what he was hearing. So in a lot of ways, I think when I think about patient-driven R&D, I feel like that really started from his hospital room for our foundation. And the way that that's taken shape in the years since, after his death, was to really focus in a very similar way to what Stuart was just saying, to focus on the missing links in research that are preventing people from placing any attention into a disease like cholangiocarcinoma. So for us, that very specifically meant helping to fund the creation of cell lines for cholangiocarcinoma, of which there were almost none, versus in a more common cancer, there would be hundreds. And those cell lines have since started to really lower the barrier to entry for other researchers to start looking at cholangiocarcinoma, and then perhaps most importantly today, for industry to start developing drugs for it. And we know that those cell lines are now in the labs at companies, and they're being used to develop treatments which are just so badly needed.
So hi, I'm Carl Morris. I'm the Chief Science Officer for a company called Solid Biosciences. I think our mission is really to focus on anything and everything to do with Duchenne muscular dystrophy. So we've taken a little bit different slant. Instead of looking at technologies, we are now looking at a disease and an indication. So that allows us to completely not only focus on one goal, and that is to identify things that could provide benefit to all the boys with Duchenne muscular dystrophy. We were founded after Alain Guinaud and Annie Guinaud had their son diagnosed with Duchenne muscular dystrophy in 2012. This happened in London. Within a year, the family had moved to Cambridge, Massachusetts, because that's where things happen in biotech, and he wanted things to happen in biotech. Within another year, the company was really founded and going. I've been there about 2 years, and I was number 4. We are now at about 60 employees, and we are hoping to be in clinic this year with a gene therapy against Duchenne muscular dystrophy. So what we've built is really a patient-centric approach to progressing R&D for Duchenne muscular dystrophy, and I think it's a very unique vision. And Alain is, for those who know him, is a very intense individual who can really drive these things and has taken that patient approach to the core, given that his son Atani has it, and I think that's what remains central to our focus as we progress.
Good morning. My name's Anna Heemberger. I'm the General Counsel and I head operations at Lifebulb. We're a very young organization. We're about almost 4 years old, and our mission is to improve the quality of life of those living with chronic illness. Lifebulb was founded by my sister, who has type 1 diabetes. She has a pancreas transplant. She has a kidney transplant. She has issues with her heart. So, growing up, I've seen what it's like to live with someone who has a chronic illness and has to battle this every day. We improve the lives of people living with chronic disease, not only diabetes, although that was our first indication. We also work with oncology and IBD and looking at all the other chronic diseases by empowering patient entrepreneurs, which I've now heard from our panelists. Almost everyone is either a patient entrepreneur or working for an organization that's founded by a patient entrepreneur, which is amazing. And we do that either by working with startups or with large organizations to do this, to provide funding for either research or developing new products to make life easier for those living with chronic disease.
On again. Yeah, thank you very much. There's many places that we can start in our discussion today about the patient in the R&D process. But the first place I wanted to start, and it was pretty clear with the last panel, it's the question of the definition of patient centricity as it's related to the R&D process. First, I'll tell you a little bit about what we've done at KCR. We realized very quickly, and I think it was mentioned during the last panel, that that term can take on several different definitions depending who you're talking to. And so what we did just about a year ago, we started an initiative throughout the regions where we operate, noting that we work in various economic and certainly medical regions of the world where access to care, standards of care is very different. And we really wanted to understand a bit more about the patient that's involved in clinical studies that we manage. So we set out to interview patients from those that basically are yet to become part of a trial through the execution of the trial and the completion of the trial. And we've been doing this now for about 8 months, and we've found out some very interesting information. We've actually looked at it not from purely a logistical perspective, but more from an emotional perspective as well. And the purpose of our study and this initiative is to be able to educate those of us within the research community what life looks like in a research program from a patient perspective. And so I invite many of you to go to #HumanBehindEveryNumber and to take a look at what we have. You'll find a short presentation there, and that'll give you a link to the larger program. There's many video vignettes throughout it, and there's some clear data as to our learnings. I think key is going to be how do we take our learnings and then apply that to the real-world R&D process in today's patient-centric environment. So I wanted to ask you, from your perspective, what does patient centricity mean as it relates to R&D from your perspective?
Yeah, well, as I said, we were founded by a father and a mom who, so when we walk into the office, the patient stares us in the face. We have pictures and images, and the families come in and visit, and I think it makes it a lot more meaningful for us because we have to think daily about what have we done today in terms of driving the programs forward. I think as a real case study, there's a need for physical augmentation. Robotics is something that a lot of groups have dabbled with, and we thought that this is an opportunity that we could do. So, but rather than just going out and building something and saying this will be good for the patients, the first thing we did is we reached out to the community, had a survey run in the community, asked the patients exactly what they wanted, what were the three, what types of things are concerning to them and could be helped with a robotics type approach. And so we started, the phase 1 of that program was about going out to the community and asking them specifically what they wanted. We identified 3 things, and now we are working with a company, a robotics company that's spun out of Stanford Research Institute to focus on a thing called powered clothing, which we hope will be a suit that can be put under the clothes. And rather than dealing with things that are of no interest and the patients would not use it, we now have at our core the ability to develop something that we know that the patients will be interested in following and using ultimately when we can get it fixed.
Obviously, we're not a research organization, but what's very interesting with this concept of patient entrepreneurship is one of our largest partnerships is with Novo Nordisk, which is the largest insulin manufacturer in the world in Denmark, and we're working very closely with their R&D group in order to identify new solutions for patients and encourage innovation within small companies. We actually have a summit in less than 2 weeks in Copenhagen where we're featuring 12 entrepreneurs within diabetes, type 1 and type 2, who are going to present and pitch their ideas to their research and development team, as well as venture capitalists and other outside people. So it's very encouraging to see that the R&D departments of these large pharmaceutical companies are really taking note and making this a priority in their business as well. Thank you.
That consumer-driven innovation is important, especially in the chronic disease clinical development, research development space. One of the questions that I think we have for the panel here is just, how do we take the lessons learned, for example, in terms of what you've been through, Anna, and how do we then move that to other potential or patient advocacy organizations?
I think it's very important to listen to the patient. No one else is going to be able to tell you what you need day to day. It's not just about the drug that's going to save your life. It's also about the device or the consumer product that's going to make your life better every day and worth living and make you feel more like a normal human being. If you have a chronic disease, you can never forget that you have it, but you can also make your life that much more comfortable. And I think that's extremely important for every organization to consider.
Thank you. I've got some R&D specific questions here. Again, there's probably members of the of the audience here that are best to answer this, but you know, I guess we just heard from the last panel, and one of the questions we had in our discussions is, you know, at what point in the R&D process does the patient or advocacy group really get involved? And how do we get that involvement earlier into the process? And, you know, I was very happy to hear that some of these companies have already started to do this, but certainly many, many others are not. So I don't know if you had any feedback or thoughts related to that.
I would say just as early as possible, and there's a lot of different ways to do that. And again, from our perspective, where we're really working on a basic research level and interacting with researchers, probably well before you know, anything is really being developed into a drug, we're trying to think about ways to get the patient voice heard there. And I think one of the simplest ways, but something that probably gets forgotten sometimes, is just having patients interact with researchers. I think a lot of researchers work incredibly hard, and they spend their time in a lab staring at a tray or through a microscope, and to put a human face on a particular disease can be really, really powerful. So that's something that we really try to do, and even just having patients interact with our community of the people who support us, just to keep them at the center of what we're doing, can be really, really important.
Yeah, to sort of build upon that. And I heard in the last panel, Jim mentioned one of his first interactions with a researcher was seeing on the laptop that picture of the patient, and that person knew that and was thinking about that every time they opened it up. I know from our standpoint, the research that eventually was licensed and is now in clinical trial, that researcher had a picture of our son up in their lab. And they told us through sort of the failures that it was that picture, and our son was the one that kept them going. They said they could not fail for Benjamin. And I think it's, you know, as Jim said, it's that personal connection and just having a knowledge that what you're doing has an impact on patients' lives is very important for the entire ecosystem, not just researchers, but the organizations as a whole.
There are also some practical implications. If you bring the patients in, one, they can provide you a better understanding of how to accelerate processes. You know, if you're designing a clinical study, you know, a patient can tell you whether it's feasible for them to do certain activities. You know, how tired do you get in a day? So if you have all these physical testing that you run on a clinical study, and at the end of it you have your primary endpoint, at the end of the day they're exhausted. And so the primary endpoint that you're basing millions of dollars in clinical trial funding on, it may be useless. And you kill a program, not because the drug's bad, but because you didn't think about really fundamental issues of how a patient will handle the clinical trial process. You know, so that's one aspect. Another one is getting reagents and getting, we can't, there's a lot of problems around industry accessing some, you know, biobanks and things like that. So the patient groups can truly help you access some of these reagents that become critical to your development process. You know, they can apply a little bit more pressure on academic groups who care about publishing rather than things that we think are a little bit more important. And so you can get that pressure applied in the right way and for the right reasons. And then the final thing is sort of around the regulatory, and I think we might be talking about this a little bit later on. But from a regulatory perspective, as industry, you know, engagement with the FDA is highly touchy and regulated. However, the patient groups can go in and have these face-to-face meetings and find out what the FDA is thinking, and then relay that back to us. There have been, PPMD, for example, set up a gene therapy panel where there was FDA and academics and industry all in the same room. And there was a reasonable dialogue ongoing about what they're looking for and what their expectations are for programs coming through in gene therapy. And I think that's highly valuable in terms of, if you work together, you can really accelerate the process, and you can also reduce the potential fundamental mistakes that you know, we as industry, we think we know everything, That's not true. And I think we have to be brought down a peg occasionally.
Yeah, I think it's going to be important to take lessons learned and really extrapolate that to other, FDA and EMA discussions moving forward. I don't know if we're quite there yet. I'd love to hear more experiences from other biotech and pharma companies that have been through the process doing it that way. Again, I don't have much information myself, but.
So my past life at Pfizer, we went to the EMA and had a scientific working advice. And on the phone, EMA had already brought in a patient advocate. And so on the phone, as we're presenting our program, there's a patient advocate, very well-known boy with Duchenne in Europe. And she was there saying, no, that's not good. And really sort of had a true voice with the regulators as they're providing feedback on our program. I mean, I think it was excellent. We were a little bit shocked, but it was excellent. They had it.
Yeah, Anna, do you want to speak a little bit more in terms of any examples how consumers or patient entrepreneurs have influenced the marketplace?
Sure. Well, an example of an influential patient entrepreneur within diabetes is Jeffrey Brewer, who founded Bigfoot, very recently and has secured a lot of funding. He's working hard to establish the first real artificial pancreas. And he was a successful tech entrepreneur, and then his son was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, and he was inspired to go into this field. He became the CEO of JDRF, which is one of the largest advocacy groups for type 1 diabetes. And then after a few years there, I don't think he even took a salary, he founded Bigfoot. And it's also very interesting that one of the patient entrepreneurs that we've been working with, John Sherlund, who founded Timesulin, which is another, it's something you put onto your insulin pen to make you remember how much insulin you actually injected and when, because for some reason, large manufacturers have not thought that maybe people forget. You forget you took your pill that day. You forgot you injected that much insulin at that time. So he thought of this very good device, and he was actually bought by Bigfoot. So I think that's a really great idea. But it's also, I believe it was Animas with Johnson & Johnson decided to make a pump that was actually pink back in the day, and took over a large part of the marketplace for insulin pumps just because, little girls now were happy to have a pump that was easy to use and that was a little cuter than the, kind of bulky gray pump. And that's how patients within that group actually told them, people don't like to walk around with a large thing like this. They want something that's pretty, and then they may actually use it. So those are a couple of examples.
Great, thank you. Stuart, question for you. We've talked about various patient advocacy groups playing a role from really the initial regulatory process through the development of a particular compound. But do you have any ideas on how organizations could work together for the same cause?
Sure. When I was talking about our journey, you might have heard that I said co-founded, co-funded, co-developed. One of the things we learned is, particularly in the rare disease community, is there's only a few of us, and it's very hard to do everything yourself. You can't literally. It's raise enough money to fund the research you want to fund. So we always look for partnerships. How can we leverage and expand the dollars that we have available? How can we engage peer organizations so that we have a broader reach and a greater hold within the patient community? One was, I mentioned, the patient registry. We started that with another peer foundation. And then we worked, once we got it established, to bring other foundations, not only in the US, but worldwide, on board because really it's the value in that registry is having the largest number of people get engaged. So the larger number of organizations we engage, the greater success we could have. The same went for the natural history study that we funded. We didn't have the resources to do that on our own, so we engaged with 2 other foundations and shared the cost of that. So those types of partnerships are really critical, particularly in that small foundation space where the resources are limited. You're dealing with a lot of volunteers, people who are, parents or siblings, and many often are working off the kitchen table. So where you can be efficient and find those partnerships, you can really start to leverage those relationships.
I would just add to that, as I sat here and listened to your intro, we focus in completely different places, but we're taking an incredibly similar approach to solve kind of a common problem. So, I think a lot of people here probably work in the rare disease space, and I think it's so important for us to sometimes look a little bit outside of what we're working on specifically and find ways to collaborate even outside of our exact disease space. In rare, where the resources are limited and where we all don't have enough funding or not enough staff, we have to leverage existing resources, whether that's from a bigger advocacy organization or even just from another group who is taking a similar strategy. So I'll get your card after this, and we'll.
Actually, that was my question. What platform? How do you do that? Looking at the audience we have today.
I mean, I think coming to this a meeting like this is a great way to do it. Taking Bob's advice and using the networking time to meet people. Attending other conferences where other groups and other small foundations are represented. That's where I've learned so much about what we've put into place in our foundation, where I've made some of my most, my closest colleagues, even outside of the cancer space.
Yeah, to build upon what Jim said, we learn from one another. So particularly in this space where I'm not coming at this as a scientist or a researcher or somebody who grew up in industry. I had to learn as I went. And the way I learned was to rely upon others that have either been there before me or were peer organizations. And really I would say the same on the industry side, is you need to continually learn about the patient populations, about the science, and we all do that and internalize it. But, that networking, and I want your card too, so I can learn more and be more efficient and do a better job in the future.
From a patient perspective, I mean, how can we help the patient to better identify potential, R&D opportunities or get their message across if they're not necessarily part of an advocacy group at this point?
Well, they're beyond just an advocacy group like Jim's or mine. There are umbrella organizations that are providing services to the patient community beyond just research and development. They're providing support and education, and a lot of what the patient advocacy organizations within industry are doing is supporting those efforts. So there's a shared opportunity here again to engage patients and help those patients out in their day-to-day living that is not specific to we're going to raise our hand and start doing work in research.
Yeah. We do a lot of work in the rare disease space, and this may be just a question of region. I'm not sure yet as we continue our study, but we found that many of our participants in our studies are fairly isolated. It's the clinical research investigator, those thought leaders that have been their voice between they and the sponsors, as well as the regulatory bodies. And from our learnings, that's one of the things we really want to really break those walls down. Interesting, those same investigators that we spoke to as we reached out to meet and speak with various patients, various ages and different disease states. We found out that there was great resistance from the investigational community, from the clinical researchers. And it was a bit of a surprise to us, but again, I think that's an area that, in this patient-centric research and development space, it's going to be important that we continue to break those barriers down.
Carl talked about it in terms of getting that input from the patient community around, as you're doing trials or choosing endpoints, patients are getting tired throughout the day and you're skewing the results you get. One of the things that we tried to engage with the investigators was the thought around travel. So here you have a single point that's doing a study, and patients are traveling in from broad parts of the country and maybe even the world. And just the process of travel affects how they're then going to be measured on those endpoint tests. So making the investigators aware of that, building in time that would give a recovery just from the travel before engaging was very important to making those results meaningful.
Well, I mean, just on the travel, I think one of the critical things is there's a cost burden associated with it. So for the patients, one of the big things that we've heard is to just make it easy, right? So take care of all the other stuff and let them focus on a lot of the kids with Duchenne are non-ambulant or have difficulty moving. So just let the parents focus on having the patient come to the site and forget about all that other stuff that is associated with the clinical trial. That was a really big learning. I mean, hindsight is obvious, but you don't think about that. Oh, okay, we'll pay you later. No, take care of the travel, take care of the money. Here's a card to make sure that you can just go and get a meal as soon as you arrive, or if you need one in the airport. Just take care of all those little details so you can focus on taking care of your kid. I mean, it again, obvious, but you don't know that until you actually live it.
Right. In this world where, from a clinical study perspective, where I spend my time, obviously we talk a lot about, scientifically rigorous and, statistically significant studies, which really takes out the personal patient element from the picture. I don't know if we have the right panel here, but, I would love to have asked the folks that were in the previous panel, just how effective, the early inclusion of, the patient perspective on their studies has been. Maybe I was the one that asked about the return on investment, but that takes on several different meanings in terms of just, how quickly a study is done, how effective a study might be, the quality of the study, ultimately with, a positive patient outcome at the end of that.
I don't know if you can calculate the money saved or whatever, but anything that helps you accelerate, one gets a potential therapy into the, approved sooner. And every day in a progressive fatal disease is a day where someone may pass. So it's really important to accelerate the process as much as you can. And I think having the vocal patient community can really drive that. We in the Duchenne community, there have been a number of AdComs, and I think the patient voice provided the FDA with, like we were talking before, provided with a face to the disease. And I think all the way through that process, you have to have that engagement. The ROI in terms of dollars, I don't know whether you can truly calculate that. It's more about just getting potential therapies moving quicker, getting more of them moving as well.
And I think that early engagement can be really, really critical. And just to give an example of that, we're lucky enough to be working on a direct-to-patient research study that sort of directly allows patients to provide, blood, saliva, tissue to generate what will become publicly available genomic data. And the very, very, very first step of this is a short intake survey. And the way that this is being put together is having a group of patients really try to inform the content of that survey, and really having them interact on every element of it. And I think it's really important because it's going to affect the patients who ultimately will fill out that survey and then participate in the study and make it successful or not. That being said, that also comes with a lot of challenge we found, because often the needs of the scientific study don't quite line up with the story that a patient might want to tell. So we're facing that challenge right now. When we had our first meeting about this in a 20-question study, we got to number 2 in the first meeting. There's so much discussion, but it's exactly what we want to be doing, because as much as we could put something out there that we think is the right thing to ask, it very clearly became apparent that that wasn't the case.
I think it's so important to involve the patient as early as you can, because the patient or the consumer of the drug or device or whatever you're developing is the only person who can tell you whether or not they're going to use it, whether they're going to adhere, whether the side effects are worth the benefits. And this is just not something you can decide in a lab. You need to ask the people who are actually going to use your product.
I mean, we're obviously all biased here on the panel, and I'm going to imagine for a large part the audience is. I don't look at it so much as what's the return on investment of engaging patients early. You can also think about that in the reverse, is what's the cost of nonconformance? And Carl mentioned it, you know, if you go down a pathway of designing a study or a trial and then find out late in that process that you're not asking the right questions because you haven't engaged the patients, there's a huge cost there of not having done what we all want you to do, which is engage the patients as early in the process as possible.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was just while you think, so that, you know, there's other, we work closely with patient groups around, you know, biomarker outcomes, things that are necessary and for clinical studies, but given that it's not a program, you're never going to see a for-profit. So we work closely with groups where we have the ability to run a study, to do something that may provide benefit to the community at large. And so we have direct interactions with a number of groups all globally that are helping support studies that may present a biomarker in the future that then we can distribute to the community as a whole, and they can be used either in a clinical trial or for determining whether there's a drug that has therapeutic benefit that's approved. So again, it's not just on the drug pipeline that you can get this patient engagement. We've talked about natural history in the panel before, talked about registries, natural history, but there's, you know, biomarkers, and there's so many other things that don't have that true, you know, to go back to the ROI discussion, true return on investment, but could provide, you know, huge benefit for the community at large if you can just get this done. So that's one thing that we're doing.
Excellent. Thank you. Carl, you've touched on this before. Can you hear it? I'm going in and out, sorry. You know, your company, you know, was founded by parents and, you know, grew from, I guess, 4 employees up to somewhere around 60 now. Can you tell us a little bit about that, you know, that path and some of the challenges you faced, and maybe some of the lessons learned that others who are sort of walking down the same trail can learn from?
You have an hour? It's you know, I came from a big pharma where you have a lot of support mechanisms, and I think, you know, if you think you want to do something, you just pick up a phone, send an email, and you can sort of get it done. In a small company, if I think of something that I want to do, it means I have to find out the person who can do it, then get a CDA in place, then have a conversation with them, then get the contract in place, and then figure out all the little details. So you're a lot more agile, but you're also constrained because there are all these relationships you have to build. I think you know, what we tried very early on, and Alan and Joel Schneider, who was the first employee, did an amazing job at just running out and meeting everyone they possibly could who could potentially in the future provide us, you know, access to information, people, whatever, to accelerate that process. So we built a network very, very quickly. Alan is I mean, this is his thing. He was a banker. He's a speculator. So he's able to go out and network and create those relationships rapidly. I think it's really important. So not just, you know, I know we're a patient advocacy event. So, you know, there was a lot of the patient advocates that he went out and tried to learn about the disease, I mean, critically, but then also who could help him and to build out this company so we could do the right things at the right time. And then since then, it's important to just build out the hires and get the right people in the right place, thinking about what we're trying to do. We're trying to do gene therapy for Duchenne muscular dystrophy, systemic delivery in patients who are 50, potentially 50 kilos. Just do the math on that. It's crazy. We talk about if you listed 100 diseases you want to do gene therapy on, Duchenne wouldn't even be on that list. It's crazy, but we have no choice, and so we're pushing, and I think it means it's a lot of work. It's crazy, sleepless nights, but you get there, you do it, and because every day you walk in and Alon says, "What have you done? What did you do yesterday? What are you going to do today?" And I think it makes it real. But it's really about, I think, networking. It comes out to networking and trying to know who are the right people to interact with, who can you work with well, and quickly, and who gets it and who's engaged. That's so critical. You need people who are engaged, and I think it comes back to the patient groups. Clearly, they're engaged, and if you go to them and you have, this is what we're trying to do, they will say, yes, great, let me help you. I'll put you in touch with this person, that person, and you can really do things more quickly.
I think one of the things that we've been very impressed upon here in the Boston-Cambridge area is that just really the interaction between companies working in very similar space. For example, there's a number of them working in the Duchenne space as we speak. And I guess MassBio has been really a component of really trying to create that interactive environment. But I'm interested to see how you could better take advantage of your neighbors here in the same area, working in the same area, in the same space.
Yeah, and I think we try it. And Annie Gonneau leads our patient advocacy efforts and works very directly with the communications. Whereas we're trying to be as engaged as possible. It's difficult because we have a clear focus as well, and we're trying to do a lot of things internally to accelerate the process. That reaching out and engaging where possible, I think it's important. It does bring up an issue though. So, we know that science is pretty bloody hard, and things don't work all the time. So there really has to be this balance between, the patient engagement, the transparency, and managing the expectations. You can't say to the patients, yeah, we're going to be in the clinic and treating 100 kids in a year, because if there's something in the manufacturing process and you can't have the drug, then you have to go back to the community and say, oh, sorry, we're not on the same timeline. So there always has to be this balance from our perspective, and I think it's even more critical for the large pharma, that the patient groups are like, tell us what you're doing exactly right now and what you're going to be doing in the next 3 months and 6 months, and give us all the details. And we can't, and it's not because we don't want to. We'd love to shout it out to the world exactly what we're doing, but if we tell you we're doing something and then drug development hits us in the face, and the average is 90% fail. So we can't say, yes, we're going to be doing this, and your kids are going to be fine in 3 years, because we just don't know if it's going to eventuate. So it's managing that message, and I think what's happening, events like this, all those patient community, is that it's an iterative process. And I think we're getting a little bit more comfortable. I'd say 10 years ago, this never would have happened. There would have been this real disengagement, and it's the patients over here, and it's evil, big pharma over here, and they throw things at each other and never talk to each other. I think now it's coming in, and we're still at that, hey, how you doing type phase, but I think it's getting a lot better, and we're starting to figure out how to talk to each other. This is a great place to be, particularly in rare disease.
Great, thank you. This is a question really for Carl, Jim Stewart and Anna. Since you come from the patient side, we've talked about the patient's involvement in the R&D process and as early as possible. Do you have any real case examples, and how effective has that been today? what's really happening in the trenches. What has the patient input been, and what does that look like? Have you seen that?
Yeah, we had a great story that was really like one of my favorite things that's ever happened professionally. I was working with a patient who was going in for, I don't know, maybe a second or third surgery, and had consented to have his tissue donated, which we were really excited about. And his tissue, after resection, was sort of rushed from the operating room into the lab and was implanted into a mouse. And given that he had a particular genetic mutation, this was really, really, really important. And in talking afterward, we were sort of talking about what happened and the fact that his tissue was in a mouse and how crazy is that. And he said, "Do you think I could go see it?" And I said, "I don't see why not." So we actually were able to arrange a meeting for this person to come in to the lab, and they brought the mouse down in a cage, and he got to see it. And I know it sounds like a little kind of sci-fi and crazy, but it was such an incredibly meaningful moment for him to see this and to see what happened and what he was able to accomplish for these researchers, and to hear from the researchers what the extent of the impact was of this one act that he did. And then on the other side of that, for the researchers to meet this person and to, like literally put a face to what they're working on, was really, really powerful. And I'm certain that they always think about him as they're doing this work, and especially when they're working with this mouse. And the impact of that, I think, will just go on and on. So I think that, that kind of interaction, while somewhat unusual, but thinking about creative ways to really engage people and bring them together like that can just have a real far-reaching impact.
I happen to have the pleasure of joining another foundation. Over the last weekend, they had a fundraising event, different disease indications than ours. And while we're ultra rare, this is ultra rare. They only have 20 some odd patients identified around the world. And the founder of this organization related a story about, again, being at the kitchen table with all their notes and being very nervous about calling up this researcher who is the one person who really was the leader in the field in their child's disorder, and getting them on the phone and having this shock of, even though this person had spent their entire career working on this one disease, they'd never met a single patient. And they were so excited on both ends of the phone to just, oh my gosh, I have an opportunity now to go beyond just the theory of what's in my lab to meeting a patient and seeing what some of these real impacts are. And for the parent, that caregiver, now somebody really cares about this. It's not just an academic exercise. It's a personal thing. And I think those types of stories and those interactions between researchers and patients and patient communities and industry are so important to bring that to the forefront.
Parents are so important in general, just to spark innovation and research. I mean, there's no greater advocate for a patient or a consumer than their parent. But just examples of ways that the patients have brought products to market, I think, are almost easier to describe when they're consumer driven, because it's a faster process. You don't have to go through the FDA. You don't have to, you don't have to find that mouse that can actually that you can actually do the research on. And I think a great example of that is we've worked with this woman who had breast cancer and had to have a double mastectomy, and then realized, oh, I can't wear normal underwear anymore. So she started a clothing line for women who have had breast cancer, and it became successful. And it's just this way of addressing an issue after going through something that traumatic that helps, you know, millions of people. And only a patient can realize what you actually need when you've gone through that. I think that's extremely important as well. But obviously, inspiring the research and, you know, creating these foundations is how we're helping people with rare disease as well.
Great, thank you. I'd like to take time now, I guess, let's open up to Q&A and also get some input if someone has some comments about what has been spoken about today.
Hi, my name is Donna Dubuque. I'm with the Neuroendocrine Tumor Research Foundation here in the Boston area. And, you know, when we're talking about research that's going on that's preclinical, you know, like CAR T, you know, in neuroendocrine tumors, the first thing that, of course, we hear from, you know, our patients is, you know, I want to be on the trial. You know, when can I be on? And, you know, 3 to 5 years or something like that before it gets into clinical is really hard, you know, for people to hear. So what I'm wondering is if we sort of talk about some of the collaboration, you know, that the group was talking about earlier, you know, how can we actually look more innovatively at trial design and collaboration across, you know, different sort of companies to begin to think about how we could sort of, you know, accelerate that development cycle. And I know of another foundation that was trying to raise, you know, whatever, $3 million to conduct an adaptive trial, you know, and their thing was, well, you know, pharma would never do that. They'd never, you know, go head to head. And there are threats, you know, regulatory-wise. I know that's a later topic, but is there something that we can do sort of to innovate, you know, ourselves to be able to sort of get better collaboration across, you know, different sort of companies to bring things sooner?
I mean, it's an awesome question. I don't know if I have a complete answer, but there are so many things that factor into it. You know, you have to follow the regulatory guidance, right? So you can't just go in and say, oh, we want to do this, and the FDA doesn't usually just give you a thumbs up. You know, there's a path you have to take. And really, you know, we have to think, we always have to come back to and think that until we know a drug works, we don't want patients just being thrown on all drugs or compounds because it's not even a drug yet. So we need to make sure and do it properly. And I think the best way to pull in the patient voice, and this is just me thinking out loud, is to learn about the outcome measures that are critical, try and figure out and understand the disease better, so we can then, in a very short period of time, know that we have target engagement, know that we have potential, you know, a pharmacodynamic endpoint that in a 3-month period says, yeah, probably we're going to be, we'll see something in a year. A lot of, you know, coming back to my Duchenne experience is, a lot of the problem with Duchenne, even if we have an awesome drug, it's going to halt the disease wherever it is. To see an effect, we have to wait for the placebos to fall away from that, which, I mean, if you think about it ethically, is terrible, but that's what we have to do to show an effect, and it's going to take time. So what can we look at earlier on before the disease has to show us? I think those are the types of things that we should be focused on. And I know a lot of the patient groups that we're working with, coming back to biomarkers, and using, now that there's been large studies, get some of the bloods, look at proteomics, metabolomics, genomic data to really better understand, so we can tickle and see if we're modulating the effect, you know, of the disease. That's just.
And I can't speak as much to trial design, but I think what we can do as advocates is help companies feel confident that they can actually recruit for the trials once they're in place. And there's a lot of ways that we can do that collaboratively, whether we're just raising awareness for clinical trials or in the space of a rare cancer, getting tumors molecularly profiled and helping patients do that, or even just helping patients get to a trial site. So I think kind of on the other end of that, that's a role that we can all find ways to work together on, even across disease areas.
Thank you. You have a question?
So I can take that one. We've dealt mostly in academia, and as sort of been alluded to, academics, parents, and industry are all driven by slightly different motivations. And while again, we weren't scientists or we're not scientists, we relied heavily upon a scientific advisory board to say, this is a good proposal, it scored well, you consider funding it. And as we started to learn through the process, we began to ask researchers some very basic questions. And they seem simple, but they had a really big impact for us moving the programs forward is, what do you hope to learn? And then what's the next step when you either prove or disprove your proposal? And we were surprised at how many researchers couldn't answer that second question, because they're not thinking about the continuum of moving to a drug development and commercialization process. They're thinking about the science and the investigational part of this. And just by asking that simple question, we sort of refocused them. And in some cases, they went back to the drawing board and redesigned their studies so that there was a stepwise progression. And obviously not everything pans out, but we think that asking that helped us continually move things forward. And you have to be careful. We weren't looking for that quick fix. We understood well enough that this is a process and you can't get it now as much as we may want it. But as long as we're moving the ball, that's really important to getting to that endpoint.
Yeah, I think you have to evaluate what's out there already, and if it makes sense to utilize a PRO that's out there. I know there's a couple of pediatric PROs that have been used, and with limited success. PTC was one of the drivers in Duchenne, and they selected, based on Genzyme's earlier work, a 6-minute walk as an outcome. That's complicated. I'm trying to be, it's a complicated endpoint, and Duchenne is a very heterogeneous disease. So now there's been a lot of effort over the last 10 years to figure out what is a good outcome. There are now other companies that are looking at things like stair climb, and then a composite functional assessment. And I know personally that there are a number of the patient groups that are working with academics who have developed PROs in other neuromuscular disease, and they're focused on trying to get that to a validated point. We also have there in our community, we have a couple of other organizations called CTAP and CPATH or DRISC that are working on endpoints and trying to capture data appropriately so we can start looking at those data, the natural history data, and see what makes sense.
Great, thank you.
It's iterative. Sorry.
Thank you very much. We have time for one more question, and up there in the corner.
Hi, I'm Blair Van Brunt, and I have a daughter with Shwachman-Diamond syndrome, which is a bone marrow failure disease. And I just wanted to encourage anybody on the panel or in the audience to, speaking of collaboration, to also think cross-disease when you're thinking about research and looking at another disease that may be on the same chromosome or similar symptoms, clinical issues. Before I had joined our board, we were, my husband and I, raising money, and I found a woman who was working on other bone marrow failure diseases, a wonderful doctor, clinician, and researcher here in the area. And so we raised some money, and I called her up, and I said, can I lure you over into our disease? And she did. She's actually become the expert in our disease, fast forward 17 years. And she still works on these other bone marrow failure diseases. And I think she's able to learn a lot from the other diseases and apply it to ours and vice versa. So I would encourage anybody to also think in that cross-sectional way, cross-disease, to see how you can forward the progress of your translational research.
I think that's a really interesting topic to be covered by maybe a future MassBio program. And, engage many of the biotech companies that operate here. So I want to thank everyone again. Thank the panel.